Today's program is tailoring an insurance program to your firm's needs. And in this segment, we will be talking about insurance requirements that your firm may face um, as part of its practice. Now, Kevin, I have a pretty broad definition of insurance here. If you could start out by explaining to the audience what an insured is, what an insurer is, and how insurance helps businesses manage their risks.
Thanks, Nahom. Very broadly, and it says right there in the first line, it's a risk transfer tool. So obviously, when you're faced with risk, there's a lot of different mechanisms you can do. You can avoid the risk, take on the risk fully. So insurance is essentially a mitigation risk tool that allows you to operate effectively as a business. And there's a lot of coverages, which we'll be talking about today, that could impact your business and important to your coverage. So within that environment, you have two parties, one being the insured and one being the insurance carrier, or insurer is often the reference in those types of policy. So the insured would be your business, the entity, or an individual, depending on the type of coverage. The insurer is the company that is agreeing to the obligation for which it's covering you and is agreeing to pay. So very simply, you are paying a premium and purchasing a policy that is providing some level of coverage in a different area. The insurance company is thereby guaranteeing that should a claim arise that's covered under the policy, they're going to pay on your behalf or indemnify you for the harm that was caused due to your actions.
Oh, great. And if you could just briefly explain the nature of the industry itself, in what type of environment do the insurers operate in, so that at least our audience gets a flavor for what the particular risks are that an insurance company has.
Sure. So one is, and I think most people are familiar with the fact that insurance is fairly heavily regulated and regulated at the state level. So obviously from an insurance policy standpoint and insurance coverage standpoint, depending on where your firm is located, so slightly different rules may apply because every state regulates this coverage a little bit differently. That's why if you write nothing down, write this down. As we continue the conversation, you're absolutely going to want to engage in conversation with your insurance professional, insurance agent, or broker to talk broadly about the risks and specifics of your firm and how best to address them. And really, from the standpoint of the overall coverage, our goal today is to try to give you a broad brush of coverage and I would say demystify a little bit of maybe the nuances or the confusion that we often hear from clients as to what I should be considering and how I should look at things.
Okay, thank you. So the first piece of the insurance coverages that we'll be talking about today will be the commercial general liability. And as Kevin stated, our goal today is to really demystify some of the issues that you as a firm and your practice are facing with insurance demands from your clients. And we'll be talking today about all of the other coverages other than the professional liability policy. So the first thing that I think most firms run into is the commercial general liability. So Kevin, could you explain what kind of businesses buy the commercial general liability policy? And also if you could briefly explain where does the typical language for such a form come from?
Absolutely. So I think from the standpoint of who's covered on this, pretty much any business can purchase a commercial general liability policy. And I would say within the design community, whether you're focused on architecture, engineering, doesn't matter, the general liability coverage, which commercial general liability, CGL is often the term of art that you would hear for this coverage, links and overlays a little bit with professional liability coverage. So obviously if you're talking in practice, there's a strong recognition around professional liability coverage policies and that need. But the general liability overlays that very much. So from the standpoint of it's dealing with negligence or things that you do that may cause harm, but the differentiation being that professional liability focuses on your negligence due to the professional services you're providing. General liability coverage deals with things that may come up from your premises or activities of your business that cause liability, your non-professional services on that side. The other element that I would say is that general liability has been offered for a long period of time, and there's a lot of standardization, although with individual carriers, you could have specific nuances or forms that they have relative to their individual programs. But there is a company, the ISO form, which is a generic form to the insurance services industry that takes information broadly around claims and impacts and try to standardize some solutions and how that coverage is being offered. That's why if you're looking at your general liability policy, sometimes it's dealt with in, unfortunately, hundreds of pages and different language, but that language tends to be fairly standardized. So as we kind of continue this conversation around this, because this is an important coverage to contemplate and consider and overlay in your business, we'll get into some of the nuances of that coverage.
Okay. So what exactly does it cover? And if we will hit on some of these issues, it covers bodily injury and property damage, personal and advertising injury, medical payments coverage. We'll talk about these. So for the audience, if you could briefly explain what we mean by bodily injury and how does the policy come into play in providing coverage for that?
Absolutely. And I think to step back, because there is a nuance and recognition that bodily injury or property damage can be covered in different components. And this is why there's that link between professional liability and general liability coverage. But from the general liability side, it's broadly designed to cover an insured's liability. So your practice's liability arising out of incidents, things that occur at your location, your premises, or from the non-professional aspects of your insured's practice. So re-emphasizing kind of the non-professional. We'll talk a little bit about some of the claims examples, on that piece. But the first piece of the puzzle to connect the dots is to make sure that general liability exposure for architects and engineers tends to focus on your premises or location where you're practicing, whether that's out of your home or an office location, recognizing that you work in the field too for some of the pieces as well. On the professional liability side, it's coverage at the project location or in the actual design, the design documents that you're delivering to the client in effort of completing the project. So with that in mind, bodily injury and property damage is covered under a general liability policy to the extent that the incidents happen at your premises or due to actions of non-professional negligence. And then obviously bodily injury and property damage is covered every day on the professional liability side, and that's bodily injury or property damage that arises from your professional services on projects. So again, there's coverage under both policies for bodily injury and property damage, but the action of what's causing the claim is going to drive where the coverage goes. And you overlay that too, that anytime you have bodily injury or property damage, you may have ancillary exposures that need to be paid, and that's personal injury to others, advertising, along with kind of, and we'll get into the medical payment side, but these are all additional damages that happen from the initial bodily injury and property damage.
Okay. So we've thrown a lot of terms at you, but we find that really the best way to explain some of these concepts is to use claim examples. And this is actually something from one of our clients. It's been a few years, but it's still a very good example of what CGL is intended to cover. And in this case, a surveyor was working on an airport runway and left his tripod standing upright on the side of the runway while he left for lunch. A small plane came in for landing, and the leading edge of the right wing clipped the equipment. The equipment created a dent in the leading edge, but there were no injuries in this case. However, the repairs to the plane and other expenses, such as downtime, parts, and labor, totaled more than $114,000. In today's dollars, that would probably be a heck of a lot more. So Kevin, briefly, just looking at this fact pattern, what are some of the key things that you would want to point out before we even get into what kind of policy would respond to this type of claim?
Well, I think this kind of reemphasizes the point that oftentimes I find with individual firms, they focus on the contractual liability that they assume or the design services that that they're happening. But this clearly recognizes that you have a broader business exposure in the services that you provide and how you operate your business. So the main piece here would be that as a design professional, you should be considering the likelihood of loss from both your non-professional actions and professional actions. But from a risk management standpoint, you want to make sure that you have procedures and quote unquote best practices that deal with situations outside of kind of the professional services you're providing, which would include in this claim example here of what maybe should have been done with a tripod in order to prevent the likelihood of that incident happening. So again, when you're thinking about risk management, make sure that you have a very broad definition on how issues could arise in your practice outside of just traditional professional liability claims.
Great. And then, this claim was covered by the CGL, and the, insured did have protection for this. But let's ask the question then. Could this type of claim be covered by a professional liability policy, and what are how would those two policies work together to resolve this type of claim if indeed that is the case?
Yeah. So this would definitely be called the gray area example, because I think on the face of it and the way the situation played out, remember a few slides ago we were talking about the differentiation between professional services and non-professional services, and also recognizing that policies like the general liability policy deals with the non-professional aspect. So the question really comes down to whether a claim is covered under one policy or another is going to be on the basis of the allegation of the claim. And so depending on how the claimant approaches this issue, they could make the allegation, similar to how it's presented here, that the existence of the tripod in an unsafe location caused damage to the plane and harm. And the fact that the tripod was there, on its face could be seen as that was part of my non-professional services, creating that situation. But knowing that the surveyor was likely in that situation, working at that location, providing professional services, there's always that situation that may come up that the allegation that came forth was the damage was caused due to the professional services being rendered by the surveyor at the location at that time, and try to trigger both those policies. So there's things you can control and things you can't control. So the important part there is you need to recognize that anytime you have a likelihood for loss due to non-professional actions at the same places where you're providing professional services. That's why, again, professional liability and general liability are closely linked. So one consideration that we recommend in discussing it with your insurance professional is the importance of having the same carrier cover both professional liability and general liability in that piece, because then you may be in a situation where it's not a question of whether carrier A versus carrier B are pointing fingers as to where the coverage should lie, but just working with the client to resolve the claim since it's all with the same carrier. So the answer in the home is it depends. But the important part here is to know that you've got that exposure in this situation regardless, and need to be aware of it.
Okay. So having discussed that, let's delve a little bit into some other coverages that come in under BI and BD, premises and operations liability. So again, I think it's easier to illustrate my example. Let's say, for example, that a visitor walks into your design firm and into your office lobby, and she slips on a marble flooring after a rainstorm and breaks her ankle. The injury occurred on your premises, and clearly the woman will be making a claim against your office for her medical expenses resulting from her broken from her broken ankle. So, the policy will respond to your liability. And clearly, from the risk management standpoint, you need to think about what is it that I need to do to prevent this. Well, if you have safe building premises, proper warning signs for hazards like wet floors, these are the types of things that you can use to mitigate the types of risks that you all face. But clearly, the CGL would be responding to this type of claim. Kevin, we'll talk about this later, but would this policy respond if the injured person was an employee of the firm?
No, there's separate coverage for that as to the harm that's caused, and we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's called workers' compensation coverage. That basically says you have an obligation to provide a safe workplace to your employees. So to the extent in the performance of their employment, they're injured, this insurance policy provides coverage, so you don't have to go through litigation necessarily, to be able to remove that harm. And we'll talk about that more later.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that this the policy is going to respond to your liabilities due to other persons in your firm getting injured in your office, and that if there's third parties that you have no relationship with, that will most likely be able to recover against your CGL policy. So that's premises liability. That is an important key.
I apologize. One thing that I would open here, knowing for people on the firm, you have maybe different situations from the standpoint of the environment that you work on. And I'm specifically thinking of office environment versus home environment. A lot of small firms and sole practitioners, for ease of doing business, may have an office in their house or home. So one thing to strongly consider, again, talking to your insurance professional, is that a commercial general liability policy can often work in situations where you were working out of your home. And the reason I say that is homeowners policies in general may provide some coverage, but oftentimes there are exclusions or strict limitations on operation of business activities out of your home. So if you have a potential client that drives onto your driveway, walks onto your location, comes into your house for a business meeting and slips and falls or is injured, your homeowner's policy may not provide coverage or may only provide very limited coverage in that piece. That's another reason, even if you're not in an office environment, everybody needs to consider general liability coverage under this type of policy.
Great point, Kevin. And then the last piece we want to talk about is operations liability. And this is something that you often see in your contract requirements, that you have premises and operations liability in your CGL. An example would be, for example, if a manufacturer accidentally flushes flammable liquids into a city sewer system, and then there's an explosion in the sewer that results in damage to the utility system, and city streets are torn up, utility services are suspended, and if other businesses in the vicinity must close because the access to the neighborhood has been cut off, that would be an example of your operations creating liability for you, and the CGL would respond to that. So it not only would it respond to the damage that is done to the city and all that, but it would also respond to the loss of use claims that the other businesses may have, in addition to any direct physical injury. So operations liability, things that may arise out of your operations, is often a key component of the CGL that is really may not be covered by your other policies. So the next thing that we want to cover under the CGL, and we're focusing a lot on the CGL today because clearly this is an element that, when we look at your contract, that drives a lot of requirements. And one of the things that we often see is contractual liability coverage requests. And Kevin, if you could briefly explain what this means and how the CGL provides contractual liability coverage for firms.
Yeah, so recognizing that under a general liability policy, they're not geared just to the design industry or any specific industry. It's covering businesses in a broad framework. So within the construction liability coverage, there's recognition of liability or obligation to perform, whether it's services or being involved at that location, that provides some level of obligation to the other side of the owner. So, for instance, contract for a lease of premises is something that is provided under general liability because oftentimes, like in an office environment, you're leasing your location or other things. So there is a recognition that you're going to have a contract in which you're going to have to operate for that protection. Same way for sidetrack agreements with railroad and these other elements. So kind of recognizing the unique relationships that are required to be responsible to another party in the operation of your business. Again, focusing on the non-professional side of that piece.
And the challenge for design firms really is that when your client asks you, hey, we want contractual liability coverage, where they're picking up the term from the CGL policy. And as you all know, the professional liability doesn't offer blanket contractual liability coverage. It only has a limited form of contractual liability, and therein lies some of the negotiation challenges that firms face. But if you want to know, broadly speaking, where the request for contractual liability coverage is coming from, most of it is being driven by the CGL policy. And then, as Kevin mentioned, the other piece that the CGL is intended to cover is personal and advertising injury. And for firms, Kevin, would you say what is the most likely scenario under which a design firm would be facing a claim that relates to their operations?
Yeah, in my experience, those first two, libel and slander, are where we see most design professionals being involved in that discussion, just by the nature of operations, with working with the owner and selection of a contractor, or involved in the contractor selection process, or just working with other entities. That's definitely something that firms should be sensitive to.
So briefly, libel is when it's a written statement that about someone that is injurious to that individual. So if you, as an architect, are making unkind comments about about the project, say to a newspaper, or about a construction contractor's performance, and it's in a written format, that would be considered libel and a harm to the other party, and they can make a claim that you made a libelous statement. Slander is when it's a spoken statement, similar concept. If you degrade somebody's reputation, or say something about a contractor, about their capabilities, then that person can say that you harm their reputation and cause them harm. So this is a type of offense that, and we have seen some of these types of claims come against firms. And really, from a risk management standpoint, you need to be cautious about when you're making these types of comments about another professional or a member of the project team. Clearly, just be aware that if you are making these types of recommendations, that you can back it up with objective, factual information, because what's always a defense to libel and slander, Kevin?
Fact.
Or truth.
There you go.
Truth is always a defense to these types of claims. So if it is based on fact, known information, and you make such a recommendation, that certainly makes your defense much, much easier. Okay, so we've said a lot about that. The last piece that we want to talk about, there's two more pieces actually, is medical payments. And this is actually a not well recognized coverage that's available on the CGL that I think is pretty valuable. Kevin, could you explain what we are talking about when we say medical payments coverage under your CGL?
Yeah, so focusing on bodily injury that occurs due to your operation of your business on a non-professional. So we're kind of separate out the professional liability side. So somebody's injured at your location. If you think about it, kind of mitigating the situation or looking long term, there may be facts at issue as to the cause of the bodily injury or what the result was and how it should be resolved. But what doesn't change is you have an individual that's hurt, and that needs to be resolved sooner. So medical payments essentially is something that is offered where it's essentially offered on a no-fault basis, where the determination of injury will be made and recovered so that the person can get the treatment that they need to resolve the issue, and then the overriding claim and obligation as to fault can be determined at a later time. Obviously, if somebody's broken a leg or is injured, and now the conversation becomes, we're not going to be able to pay for your medical treatment until after the claim's resolved, you probably have a claimant and an individual that's in a much more litigious mood. So this is helping to mitigate the issue at hand, which is the person was injured, and will allow some time to determine who is actually at fault and how the claim will be resolved.
Yeah, and then the key to realize here is that it can be triggered, the coverage will be provided without the person who's been injured actually filing a claim. If the facts and circumstances are such that somebody got injured and they needed medical treatment, then the CGL coverage will pay for their medical bills related to that incident, and that's a pretty powerful coverage. And Kevin, to your point about firms that are running operations or services from their homes, this is also an important element to consider, right?
Absolutely, because your homeowner's policy likely is not going to provide that coverage, or to the extent from a cost standpoint that will cover an injury of that nature.
So the last piece we want to talk about is additional insured status, again, mostly because this is a requirement that firms like yours often see, that we want to be an additional insured. That's totally fine if you're just limited to the CGL. But the challenge for firms is that you're often asked to have an additional insured on the professional liability, and that is certainly something that is not wise nor can be accommodated. But the additional insured request often comes in because indeed clients can be an additional insured on your policy, on your CGL policy, and that's an endorsement that can be provided. So with that, let's delve into your other insurance policies that matter or should be considered for design firms. And the first thing that we want to talk about briefly is property insurance. Now, Kevin, explain what we are talking about here, what kind of issues or what the coverage terms look like for property insurance.
Right. So after spending a lot of time talking about the relationship between professional liability and general liability, which are often liability-based losses, things that you do that cause harm, property insurance are things that happen to property that you own or rent or involved with due to a wide variety of events, and some are listed here. It could be a fire at the location, a fire from adjacent property has smoke damage to your building, wind, etc. So this policy is something that you purchase in order to protect the asset, which is the building or the location of your offices. And oftentimes, there's a lot of coverage from the standpoint of the actual building and materials within that. So the computers, your work that you're providing, within that to operate your business. Most policies these days are written on what's called an all-risk policy, where there's not a listing of specific events that could happen that would trigger coverage on this policy, like just fire or wind. That it's essentially any risk that causes damage to your property could be subject to coverage. But there is the availability of a peril-specific type of coverage, and also depending on your location, especially in earthquake-prone or flood-prone locations, you may need to have a separate policy to address coverage to a specific peril, like an earthquake policy or a specific flood policy on your location.
And for design firms, we think the most important issues to consider are what's called office contents coverage and valuable documents. Um, and really, you want to be able to make sure that the your contents in your office, the things that actually allow you to do your services, provide your services, if there is something that damages that property or uh, it is lost, then that you have insurance to cover you for that direct physical loss. Um, and make sure that you at least have some of that risk has been transferred. Um, the other thing that to consider is, of course, valuable documents, and this is often thought by design professionals. Kevin, could you explain what we mean by valuable documents and how firms need to get that, and contrast that with the cyber liability policy that we'll be talking about next?
Yeah, so to set that up, office contents is kind of that physical aspect of what you have, the computer, the chairs, the tables, etc. Valuable documents speaks to the things that you have in your business that, without reusing the word, are valuable to your practice. So these would be your files relative to design documents, things that you need in order to maintain and procure your business. And so from a property standpoint, um, there's coverage for damage or harm to those documents so that they can be replaced in a form or fashion or recreated, so that you can continue to operate your business. Some of the dialogue around as we get into cyber or some of the technology coverage is that property insurance sometimes doesn't extend to the electronic files, or some of the other technology pieces that could be damaged or harmed due to peril. So cyber deals with more specific issues relative to harm caused, and we'll talk more about that there. I would say from a risk management standpoint, again, stepping back and saying, engaging your insurance professional in conversation, we often hear firms on the high end of this is one where you want to maintain a document that shows everything that would be content and documents, and that's updated periodically. Oftentimes firms grow or expand into additional space and get additional content, and then when the peril happens, you want to be able to get that information to your insurance carrier to determine what was lost or the value of that property. So, keeping an updated record of those lists, the broker can assist you with that, but that's just something that you want to be able to do consistently.
Okay. So the kind of new kid on the block, at least by insurance standards, is cyber liability. A lot has been written and talked about in the last few years, especially with the news reports about cyber breaches and the harm that it's causing to consumers and to businesses. In the context of design firms providing services, what should a firm be thinking about when we're talking about cyber liability? What does the coverage look like, and how does that relate to the practice policy that they have? If you could talk to that, Kevin.
Sure. So I will preface this as I have before, knowing that everybody may have some different carriers and coverages along the way. This is another aspect that you'd want to engage your insurance professional as to how your current policies or how best to address those issues, because within a general liability policy and several others, there may be very limited coverage, but oftentimes it's a very small limit or very limited from the standpoint of what's covered. What you want to make sure you understand and recognize is that in the operation of your business, obviously you're using technology. Whether it's project-based websites or interaction by email or communication outside, there's a lot of technology that's used in the performance of your professional services, building information modeling software, et cetera. So what I want to do is separate in your mind the systems or services that you use in the performance of your professional services. Because oftentimes the professional liability policy provides coverage for professional negligence caused by use of a BIM model or some other aspect. The thing that I find that firms often don't see is you also have business operations and harm that can come to you on that side. So a cyber liability insurance program deals with things that may impact you as a first party that cause damage or harm to your business, or things that you accidentally do to a third party as well. So from a third party coverage, you could, from the office, mistakenly send malware to a location that impacts the system of another carrier, another business, another client. But where we see a lot of the exposure for architects and engineers, and really for pretty much any business, is the first party loss. So somebody hacks into your system and locks down your cloud or computer files, and you don't have access to design files. They send an email that says that they want you to pay, a cybercoin or some other element to recover that piece. This policy is designed both for your first party harm that could come from those aspects, including the digital crime and the ransomware aspect of it. You also have the ability under this coverage to get access to breach response team, people that specialize in the industry with rectifying those situations as well. More broadly, though, there's a broad definition of damages or what's covered there. So recognizing separate from the loss of the equipment or damage to property, you have a huge exposure from loss of business time, recovery, or other economic expenses that involve in that. And this policy is designed to cover a multitude of those damages.
So if you take nothing away from this program, this is a piece that there are now robust solutions in the marketplace for cyber liability, but there's still a significant number of firms that don't carry this. This is something that you should certainly consider because it reflects your vulnerabilities and the way you do business in 2019. So certainly cyber liability should be something that you look at. So for the remaining of the presentation, we'll be talking about more common kind of vanilla coverages that all firms, especially if you have employees, should have. And the first one, of course, is workers' compensation. Kevin, briefly, what is workers' compensation designed to cover, and what are the benefits of having a workers' compensation scheme for an employer?
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit earlier, but this is protection of coverage that's provided to your employees that cover both medical expenses, medical care. It could include an unfortunate situation where that employee is killed with death benefits, obviously lost wages and rehabilitation that's there. But more broadly, from an underwriting standpoint, a policy of this nature is rated based on the firm's payroll. So again, talking about that insured relationship, the insurance paying a premium for them to meet the obligations of payment for their employees, and the insurance company is basing what your payroll is and the classification of those employees and where they fit into to determine, what that premium is. It's also what's called an auditable policy, which recognizes that during the course of the year, you could add or remove employees. And so there's always a catch-up provision within that to make sure that, you're paying the premium for the exposure that you have so that you have the availability of coverage as well. That's why classification of employees are really important to this piece.
So by way of example, if you classify a person, one of the employees, as having a full-time office job that involves them providing design services in your office, they will have a lower rate, a lower classification than another individual who is providing construction contract administration services on site. So your inspectors and so on, because they have that exposure to being out on site, would be rated differently. And as you work with your broker, it's important that you be able to that you get the right classification for each employee down. And then, as Kevin mentioned, it is auditable, so you want to make sure that you're paying the correct rate instead of finding a surprise later on in the event that the carrier reviews your files.
And I would say the other thing is for smaller firms too, is to have the conversation with your insurance professional about whether you're obligated to carry workers' compensation based upon the number of employees within your firm as well.
And often tacked on to workers' compensation is employer's liability. If you're in a state that an employee feels like workers' compensation doesn't adequately cover the loss and they have an avenue to pursue the employer directly, then employer's liability to your employee will is there to cover that. So this insurance is there generally to extend your policy, your workers' compensation policy, if you are facing separate liability. Um, that's just something to have a discussion with your broker. And so you have workers' compensation, employer's liability designed to cover your exposure um, as it relates to injuries. Now, the next piece we're going to talk about are employment practices liability insurance. And this really relates to the exposure you have due to being an employer subject to federal and state statutes that relate to your employment practices. Kevin, if you could introduce the concept, how long has this been available? Where did it come from? And talk a little bit about what this is intended to cover.
Yeah. So the expansion of this as an individual policy to address these types of claims and issues really sprang up in the early 1990s. Coverage of this nature was provided previously, but was often embedded within general liability policies. I think in general, you find that emerging exposures often originate from general liability policies. The reason that it came out and into their own form is we started to see increases in these areas around allegations of discrimination and claims costs and other aspects of it. And so general liability was not able to adequately cover or price effectively for that exposure. Companies started to spin that out into separate policies that we see today. And even over the last 15, 20 years, you now see them combined, depending on your area of operation, I mean, broader than the design community, of a package policy that includes maybe fiduciary or crime or some other elements. But for our purposes, EPL coverage is important to architects and engineers on that last piece. The retaliation aspect of it is really an area of concern from your standpoint.
It also covers claims not just related to your obligations under these various statutes, but also breach of employment contract issues, whistleblower retaliatory measures, defamation, and really the nitty-gritty of an employer-employee relationship that may be subject to a claim in a court. So what you should think about is, okay, as an employer, I have these exposures. What are some of the potential risks that I have, and what pieces do I have to manage that? Obviously, there are practical risk management things that you can do, like an established employee manual, procedures in place to help guide the relationship so that folks who may feel aggrieved do have a process, and obviously some of these depend on the size of your firm. But as a business owner, you certainly need to pay attention to what those exposures are and how to successfully manage that. And employment practices liability is a fairly common piece that is available to you. And along those lines, there's also, if you're running a company.
Hey, one thing just to close out, and again, just thinking more broadly, is recognize in the practice of the design professional, you interact with clients. And so within the scope of that retaliation or employment practice liability, and to reaffirm what Nahom's talking about, the importance of risk management process and having guidelines or obligations from the standpoint of how you act in the environment, is we do see claims where clients that you're working with come into your premises and act inappropriately to receptionists or to people within your firm, that if it's ignored or not reacted to or dealt with as a best practice, could lead to liability of this nature. And then vice versa, you have employees that are interacting with other clients outside or even within meeting environment. So it goes both ways. So this just reaffirms the fact that even if you don't have a formal HR director and you're a small business and kind of operating as a partnership or other obligations, having conversations and standard procedures around employment practices and an understanding of a non-discriminatory environment will really help, both from the standpoint of engaging with your clients, but having a good atmosphere and climate within your firm.
Let's talk about directors and officers liability insurance. It really is intended to cover for those folks who are running a company against claims alleging breach of duty, negligence, error, or misrepresentation. What are some of the exposures that a director and an officer of a company have, Kevin, and what does this policy provide coverage for?
So broadly, it's essentially that they've got a standard to carry out their duties really with the best interest of the organization in mind. So this policy provides, to the extent that somebody says that they didn't, and the directors and officers were acting in good faith in those decisions, this policy will provide protection against the directors and officers so that they can manage the company, effectively.
And that somebody in this case is oftentimes a shareholder, somebody who's an owner, who is the director or an officer by virtue of their role is supposed to look out for the interests of the shareholders and for the interests of the company. But if their allegation is made that they are somehow self-dealing or not looking out for the company, they have breached their duty of care and loyalty to the company and shareholders, that exposure is something that will be covered by directors and officers liability insurance. It's just something to keep in mind also if you are serving in a volunteer capacity on a nonprofit. Oftentimes you should really look to see if they have this kind of policy in place designed to protect you for your service, so that at least there is some policy out there that will protect you in the event that you're facing this kind of claim.
And that could be anything, so not just from a corporate environment, that could be an HOA group that you're involved with, thinking that maybe that's more prevalent. Any type of organization where you're making decisions on behalf of housing authority or some other aspect, you'd want to ask the question to make sure that coverage is provided.
Okay. And then finally, we want to talk about some of the more typical coverages that you have probably run into in your personal life as well. And the first one being automobile liability insurance. Clearly, you're running a business, and in this day and age, there's a lot of issues that come up with driving. Kevin, if you could address what this coverage provides and how businesses should think about protecting their business interests when it comes to automobile liability.
Right. So depending upon where you are with your firm, and I would say, sole practitioner up to a larger firm, I'll start on the small end first. I mean, a lot of individuals may not purchase this particular coverage because they're operating their personal vehicle and they're operating that in a business environment. So similar to what I talked about on a home office, you should have the conversation with your insurance professional around whether or not this policy is appropriate and the differences between that and a personal auto policy. So again, this deals with your commercial operation. So these are for cars that are driven for company business. Some companies may buy or rent or lease cars on behalf of their employees. So these are essentially owned vehicles, and there's coverage for that. Oftentimes, firms may have what's called rented or non-owned vehicles, which extends coverage to maybe your personal vehicle while operating on company business, or if you're renting cars at an airport or renting cars to drive to that particular location, that extends coverage in that environment too. So, you may have already addressed this or looked at this, but this is, again, something you want to talk to your insurance professional. I will say of all the coverages that I've talked about, this is one that is consistently running a temperature from a loss perspective and overall in the industry. And the issue is really around some problem areas that are developing, including distracted driving and other and other aspects around that. So this is a coverage where an insurance professional can really help you navigate that. And also is another area where you want to make sure you have best practices or procedures in place around capture of driver's information and other aspects to be able to manage that risk more effectively.
And from a risk management standpoint, some of the procedures or expectations you have of your employees could well drive some of the issues here. So to the issue of distracted driving, if the expectation is that your project managers will respond to your emails whenever, whatever, and they happen to be driving, that could be an issue that needs to be addressed as to what your expectations are, knowing that distracted driving could lead to possible accidents. So your practices as an employer and what your expectations are need to be clearly spelled out and addressed so that you are so that it's clear what your expectations are as to what your employees are. So this issue needs to be addressed in your manuals as well. The last piece we want to talk about just briefly is aircraft watercraft insurance. Kevin, if you could explain what we mean by that and how design firms specifically need to think about this type of exposure.
Yeah, so we've got two issues up here on the slide. So from the standpoint of the aircraft and watercraft as used a part of your practice, we'll overlay just a quick professional liability conversation. Is there's often recognition in the professional liability policy, including ours, that we're not going to exclude coverage or limit coverage on the basis of how you perform your professional services. So sometimes you may need to access the location via watercraft or aircraft, et cetera. So, from that standpoint, it's there. But from a property and casualty standpoint, the other coverage is if you have level of complexity where you may own a watercraft or rent watercraft or aircraft to perform those services, that requires a whole level of different coverage to protect both employees that are flying on the aircraft or operating the watercraft, or for essentially the property type of coverage to the extent that you own that material. I think everybody should be aware of drone coverage because there's really kind of emerging issues that are coming up. You can hear over the last year and a half, where now the FAA is regulating the use of drones or operation of drones. And to be a licensed operator, you go through a process with the FAA to get that license and do that. So from the purposes of us, knowing that everybody's in a different piece, what I want to leave you with is, one, if you're operating a drone or using a drone in the performance of professional services, like maybe to visualize a project during the construction management phase, or for surveying operations at a tough location to get to, our professional liability policy does not exclude or limit coverage for the use of drones in the performance of professional services. But you need to make sure that if you have licensed drone operators, or you're hiring a licensed drone operator to perform that service, you want to talk to your insurance professional to make sure that you have adequate coverage. There may be an ISO endorsement that can be added to the general liability policy to deal with things, the non-professional actions that may happen in the operation of drones that cause damage, like crashing the drone onto an automobile or others. Or if you have a licensed drone operator or hiring that, they may need to have a license and insurance policy that's broad and specific to operating a drone, much like a pilot.
Okay. So that pretty much ends the discussion that we have. Just in a few minutes that we have, as clients demand that you carry insurance and various limits, deductible obligations, what is the tool that a design firm may have to address that? Are there any policies that they can purchase to provide additional limits? What is available out there?
Yeah, so we don't have time to get into all the deal of it, but what the issue of what limits to carry. We hear that on the professional liability side all the time, whether it's directed by the owner or you're contemplating that within your business. We get the same questions on these other coverages, including the general liability, et cetera. What we find in that element is there's often mandatory minimums, limits within the state or within a particular coverage that have to be maintained in order to have a valid policy. There is a policy coverage called an umbrella policy or excess policy. And what it's designed to do is to provide a single limit, an overriding limit that would address multiple policies. So whether it's your general liability or your automobile policy, your workers' compensation, et cetera, it's essentially a blanket policy that provides excess coverage over your primary limits for causes of loss that are covered under that primary policy. And oftentimes those limits can be sizable and also affordable to deal with the issues that you have on individual projects. As a design professional, a lot of clients recognize that your general liability exposure is more of an office exposure and therefore may not drive the need for higher limits beyond your primary coverage. But as a firm, if you're involved in construction or other activities that may require a higher limit or other pieces as well. For now, you just need to know that there is an excess policy, commonly known as an umbrella policy, that can help to address the severity risk that you may have unique to those types of policies.
Thank you, Kevin. So we're going to wrap this up. For more information, we urge you to visit our website. Here's a look at our new website. If you have not already established an account and you're policyholders of ours, please do. You should do so. There's a lot of information. Once you register on our website, you can view claim studies, practice management information, contract language, commentary, and even past webinars, for which you can now get continuing education units and much, much more. With that, I thank you for your attention, and thank you. I thank you for participating today. I've stopped recording, and Kevin, I wanted to say thank you for participating in this webinar.
Thank you, Nahum. Appreciate the time.
And I look for that emailed survey with information on how you obtain continuing education credits. And if you have any questions, please contact Andrea Tyler at our office.